Great, thank you. I'm at Caulfield. I'm housed in the management department, but I do work relating to the intersection of management science and moral and political philosophy. You can see my presentation, right? Great, awesome, thanks. So today I'm talking about the role of conscience in transactions, and it's a pretty sort of specific question. So it's not just, in general what the role of conscience in transactions is, but who should we sell to, and in particular, when should we feel justified in refusing to sell to someone based on some normative commitment, whether we think of it a political, personal, moral, religious commitment. Okay, so here's two examples from the past couple of years. The former press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, was kicked out of a restaurant, largely because the restaurant owner disagreed with her sort of defense or working with President Donald Trump. We also had a case in the wake of a massacre shooting in Orlando, where a Maine restaurant owner, which is a rather famous restaurant, ranked top 5 most serene or attractive restaurants in the country. It was on a bunch of magazines. The owner of that restaurant said, if you support assault rifles, don't eat here. You're not welcome in our restaurant. So these are just two examples of a larger phenomenon, which is people refusing to sell to potential customers based on some normative commitment they hold. And so I begin by distinguishing 3 views on conscientious refusals. And if your view is not reflected here, that would be wonderful to learn, and maybe I'm missing something. And I'll go through each of them in turn. But the first view is conscience always counts. So the idea is that we're talking about all else equal justification. So there are cases in which the stakes might be high and a refusal is necessary or something like that. But when we're just talking about refusals in general, I want to just establish, well, are refusals typically justified or not that are based on conscientious reasons? So the first one says they're basically always presumably justified. Okay, so you can use your conscience however you want in the market. The second one says that, yes, that's true, we'll defer to you using your conscience, but only when it's consistent with a certain sort of progressive vision or a vision of equality, right? And third is what I will sort of try to defend, and what I'll define as what I call market impersonalism. And I'll explain exactly why I call it that, but it holds that actually all refusals are generally unjustified. So the first one is totally permissive, the third one is totally restrictive, and the second one sort of just is permissive with regard to refusals, but just adds a sort of progressive constraint. Okay, so let's start with the first one, conscience always counts. There aren't many people who believe this in the literature, so I tried to supply them an argument of why you can always use your conscience, presumably, in the market. One basic argument is that if vendors can refuse to sell to people based on profit. So we often say, well, if you can't pay enough money, I won't sell you the pool. If you can't pay enough money, I won't sell you the car, right? So we make refusals based upon self-interest all the time. So if you can make refusals based on self-interest, the argument goes, maybe you can also make them based on conscience, right? So if we think that vendors can generally permissibly make refusals based on profit alone, and if vendors can make refusals based on one kind of reason, they can make refusals based on nobler kinds of reasons. C, conscientious reasons are nobler than profit-focused reasons. D, therefore vendors can generally permissibly make refusals. So if we're allowed to make refusals just based on our own self-interest, the case goes that we should be able to make refusals usually based on our conscience, right? But this misses sort of a key point. And that is that conscientious commitments are not always nobler than self-interest, right? So we have pool vendors who make decisions on whether to sell a pool based on profits, but they also embrace some other side constraints, right? Maybe non-discrimination, they won't harm people, etc. But there's a lot of historical examples, of course, where people's conscience are rather ignoble or horrible, right? They take as their aim domination, they take as their aim some sort of notion of superiority or distorted Darwinian vision of the future, something like that. So we can't sort of just say conscience always counts, because some consciences are very bad, right? So we can't have unconstrained conscience in the market. There has to be some sort of criteria to limit it if conscience is still going to be viable. And that constraint is what number 2 tries to form. Okay, so position 2. So position 1, we've just said it's totally permissive with conscience, but the problem is that it's too permissive, that it allows people to do rather bad things with their consciences. Position 2 says, okay, maybe we'll just restrict conscience to make sure that it's sort of consistent with what Sepinwall calls an egalitarian ethos. So instead of being totally permissive or restrictive of conscience, we say, well, number 1, if you're an egalitarian, if you embrace equality, you're going to forbid refusals that would discriminate against individuals on a specific set of characteristics. So we'll use the concept of racial discrimination. Of course, racial discrimination is impermissible. And so the egalitarian ethos says, of course, you're not allowed to refuse based on that characteristic. But then again, it also explicitly permits refusals relating to animus towards those individuals. So the example Sepinwall uses in her paper is there are cases in which hate groups want to host a conference, or they want to host a party, and they try to get a vendor, they try to get a hotel, they try to get a caterer, and the idea is, well, can that hotel refuse them? Can that caterer refuse them? Sepinwall says, of course, yes. If we care about equality, we should allow vendors to avoid participating in sort of hateful projects, okay? And then outside of those sort of more special cases of animus or hate, we just sort of assume refusals to be permitted, subject to balancing against third-party interests. So in general, basically, the way Sepinwall summarizes this position is that hate has no home here. And once you sort of make sure that you're either forbidding refusals that promote hate or permitting refusals that would allow vendors to remove themselves from promoting hate, then we can still just defer to the role of conscience in a larger market. She says people have a vested interest in following their conscience, and so long as their conscience isn't leading them to violate this substantive principle of equality or egalitarianism, you should be able to use your conscience in the market. Okay, and in favor of this, again, a lot of the cases that we examine in the literature of transaction refusals are objectionable precisely because they violate this sort of norm of equality, right? So it matches up with some of the cases that we think are problematic. Okay, so I agree with parts of this position and disagree with other parts. So what does this sort of position get right and wrong? Well, what it gets right is that we certainly need to carve out explicit permissions for refusals to groups that would expose other groups to animus or make the vendor party to such an exposure. So it seems right that we should allow people to refuse transactions when it would require them to participate in sort of a hateful gathering at a conference hotel or something like that, right? But once we accept this constraint's rather narrow. It only applies to a set of cases. It's an open question otherwise as to whether refusals outside the set of cases are generally justified. So we still have our question, okay, we'll make a rule for sort of hateful projects, but outside of those, can we generally still use our conscience in the market? And position 2 says yes. And so that's the part I think is incorrect, and that I'll try to make the case that it's incorrect, that we shouldn't still have this sort of general deference to conscience given individuals' interests in following them. Okay, and so that gets me to my sort of main position. And that's position 3, and it's what I call market impersonalism. So remember, position 1 was totally permissive of using your conscience. Position 2 constrained conscience a little bit with a sort of standard of equality. And position 3 flips it and says, actually, we're going to be generally restrictive of conscience. Conscientious refusals are usually unjustified. And so in other words, so the reason that this position is called market impersonalism is because it holds that the market should be quote unquote impersonal, which is to say that we should generally alienate ourselves from our conscientious commitments. And so it embraces this norm that we only transact on reasons relating to one another's productivity, which we can call generally economic reasons, as opposed to conscientious reasons. And so this sort of summed up leads us to the position that we should not be engaging generally in conscientious refusals. And I'm going to give much more background, sort of both the intellectual background of this position and then the specific arguments that can support it. But I did want to note that this position has an unlikely ally in Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So in the late Justice Ginsburg's many of her dissents, she actually makes the case that markets are about pursuing profit and that employers shouldn't be imposing their conscientious beliefs on their employees or making decisions based on employment, based on employer conscientious beliefs. And so she saw this position as actually a liberating one, in that, for instance, in Hobby Lobby, it allows us to say why the employers of Hobby Lobby should not sort of use their conscience in deciding how and whether to provide their employees health insurance or health coverage. Okay, so this is not sort of a specifically right position, although I rely on classically right writers like Milton Friedman in order to elaborate its argument, but it has sort of allies on both sides of the aisle. Okay, so what's the sort of intellectual background for this position? And I rely on a few writers. So one is this argument from Milton Friedman, what an impersonal market looks like. He says it separates economic activities from political activities and protects people from being discriminated against in their economic activities for reasons that are irrelevant to their productivity. Okay, so it embraces this notion that the market is impersonal in that it means that we only transact based on economic reasons. Hayek argues that actually we have this abstract market order which coordinates millions across the globe, but that wonderful order would be corrupted if we were to, quote, make it a condition for the membership of a society that one approved of or deliberately supported the concrete ends one's fellow members serve. So he says, listen, we have this wonderful network and market order of millions of people cooperating to make great things, but then we shouldn't make a condition of membership of this global society that everyone agrees and deliberately supports everyone else concrete ends. That we should be able to be members of this society despite having intractable disagreements as to concrete ends. And finally, this sort of leads us to what has been called the thesis of modernity when it comes to sort of markets. And the idea is that because modern society is so pluralistic, it's so diverse, we need markets that rely on incentives to organize themselves rather than social solidarity or sort of a consensus of common ends. Okay, so because we all disagree so intractably, and that's not going away, we can't possibly organize markets around some sort of fixed set of social norms or social solidarity. We need to rely on incentives, or what Adam Smith calls self-love. Okay, so that's the intellectual background. And then here's also sort of an illustration of impersonalism in practice. So I can sort of make it more concrete with an example. What does an impersonal market actually look like? And I rely on the sort of famous account by Voltaire of the Royal Exchange in London, where he recognized that, he observed that it was a place more venerable than many courts of justice, where the representatives of all nations meet for the benefit of mankind. There, the Jewish person, the Muslim person, the Christian person transact together as though they all profess the same religion. And then, he goes through all these sort of Christian sects that transact together. And then when they all are done transacting together in these markets, they go back to their respective churches. They go back to their sort of intractable differences in religious beliefs. And so the exchange was this unique sphere where everyone who sort of otherwise, at least at this moment, had great distaste and sometimes hate for one another, could still engage in this meeting for the benefit of personkind. Okay, so that's what an impersonal market looks like. So what exactly is the argument for impersonal markets? So I've given you a little bit of intellectual background which suggests it, but I want to sort of formalize it more clearly. And there are basically two. So impersonalism has two objections to conscientious refusals generally in markets. One has to do with domination, which is sort of the notion that differences in ways of living and beliefs are liable to be quashed or suppressed in markets, because markets have gatekeepers and they have majorities. So if we embrace a norm where we can use our conscience in markets, people will sort of have their differences quashed. And number two, there's this notion that only transacting with people who we approve of threatens to atomize markets, break them up into little parts, right? So we have big, large markets that are healthy, that generate a bunch of wonderful stuff, communally and individually, goods. But when this larger market breaks up into, to use Voltaire's example, the Christians only transacting with the Christians, the Jewish people only transacting with Jewish people, that would be a great loss. Why? Because we would all suffer the significant negative individual and communal consequences of a large, healthy market being basically destroyed into smaller pieces, obliterated in a way. Okay, so I have a couple of things spelled out, but it's a little, I'll just skip one slide. So let's start with the first objection, domination. What is the concern? The concern is that, again, people will have their activities or their beliefs regulated by people who are powerful within the market. So the example I use in the paper is that some people might be tempted to refuse to transact with someone because that someone paints erotic art in their free time. And I want to say in this paper that actually is something that impersonalism stands against. They say, no, you shouldn't be transacting or refusing to transact with people based on their politics, based on their hobbies, based on what they protest. In fact, we should separate out politics and civil spheres from the market spheres. And so that's why I attribute to this view a sort of underlying theory of a sequestration of politics. So Friedman argues that we need to separate economic activities from social and political activities, and that there's significant value in differentiated spheres of society where the market adopts norms of radical inclusivity, and then politics addresses moral and legal questions. So the market is basically a reprieve or a haven from the majoritarian influence of politics, right? So where ideally everyone is generally seen as the same is in every respect, except with regard to productive capacities, with regard to whatever economic reasons we have. And this actually differentiation of spheres, separating the market from politics, actually reduces the opportunity for total domination, because now at least we have one sphere where where politics is not imposed upon individuals. And then, of course, politics also serves as a check on the market, where politics can regulate the market. It can serve as an arena for people to actualize and voice their gripes and complaints. And so there's this idea that the domination concern says we need to separate out politics from markets, because politics would threaten to sort of hold valuable market resources hostage to other people living how we would want them to live, how our conscience, our personal consciences would dictate that they live. So what I want to say here briefly is that this concern doesn't always apply. And why? Well, because there's a lot of cases, if a bar owner, for instance, refuses a particular sports fan, it's hard to call that domination, right? So domination doesn't always apply, and I argue it doesn't really get us to the conclusion that we want. And so the conclusion that we want, I think, is better gotten to, the impersonalism position is better established by this concern for the health of markets. And so under impersonalism, markets are understood as being about production that enables individual and collective prosperity in the face of a diversity of reasonable visions of the good life. Okay, and so the larger the market, the more sort of inclusive the market is, the more opportunities we have for social cooperation, advantage exchange, division of labor, direction of productive capital. And so markets are forums that are and should be designed precisely for interacting with people that are not necessarily like ourselves. All right, so last slide. So the sort of upshot of this concern that, oh, markets are for interacting with a diversity of individuals. Once we reject that norm and we start saying, no, we will sort of filter our transactions, who we will sell to based on our conscientious commitments, we threaten to balkanize or atomize those markets, splinter them into smaller markets of the like-minded. And so impersonalism holds, here's this quote from Joel Coleman in the second bullet, we should prefer institutions that maximize the domain or scope of social interaction for mutual advantage, which do not themselves require broad consensus. So we should try to avoid social and moral commitments in certain spheres of life in order to achieve what's otherwise an individual collective good of healthy markets. And so that is the central position of impersonalism. We care about individual freedom, which means that we should have the market as a sphere of society that embraces individuals regardless of their values or practices. And number two, that if we care about markets as an individual and common good, then we should have the market as an arena for norms, in particular, impersonal norms that maximize economic interaction, competition, and cooperation. Okay, so I'll pause there for questions, and thank you.
I'm muted. Thank you, Matt, for the presentation. Well done. I liked what you said at the end there with the arena, with the market itself. If there's anyone in the audience that has a hand raised or wants to go ahead and unmute with a question, please feel free to do so, or you can type it into the chat and I will address it too. Well, I had one, and I've been trying to figure out how I want to phrase this. Most of your talk is about the separation of the market from social and political aspects. Oh, I see Kate has a hand raised too. I'll address this real quick, and then we'll get to you. So, what is the line between having a distaste or disapproval of, you mentioned someone that has erotic paintings or whatever, sports teams, whatever it may be. What is the line between distaste and disapproval versus people that have a reputation of conducting intentional harm or engaging in misinformation and having that person come into a cafe or conducting business dealings with companies that have a poor reputation? Where does that fall in?
Sure. So I do think we need to make allowances, just as we make allowances for sort of hate-related projects. I don't think you should feel that as a vendor, you need to be recruited into projects that promote violence, right? So if you sell, if you run a gun store and a mob comes to you trying to buy guns, I think you can refuse them, right? But then the question is, okay, well, there's harm, there's discrimination, where else do we go? And I end up trying to just sort of maybe make the narrower point that we shouldn't be concerned with complicity as a problem. We should be concerned with promoting sort of secular bads, whether that's harm, animus, something like that. But when we merely do not want to associate ourselves with someone that maybe we think is just objectively horrible, right? I think we should avoid that. So we all are tempted not to associate ourselves with people we find conscientiously sort of terrible. But I think we should engage in sort of a heroic alienation to say, no, my economic interactions do not also intersect with my sort of moral personality, right? Me selling this bread to this person, Friedman talks about not wanting to transact with communists. So we can use his example that Friedman would still sell bread to a communist person, not because he at all agrees with them and he thinks that they are actually a harbinger of injustice, right? But because he thinks, no, my moral identity does not intermix when we're sort of selling and buying stuff. And so I think that's the norm we should try to adopt.
Thank you. I see we have a few minutes left before we're going to transition. I see Kate's got a hand up, and we'll get to Chelsea after Kate. Kate, go ahead.
Great, thanks. So I'm worried about the role of protesting kind of for the sake of healthy markets. And so I'm worried there might be more allowances that end up popping up. So it seems like if what we care about is having sort of the radically inclusive market that you talked about, then it seems to me like there might be a lot of cases where I might want to conscientiously kind of use my conscience to object, but if I'm doing it for the sake of a healthy market, so thinking back to like the lunch counter protests during the civil rights movement, right? Of saying like, we're gonna sit at the lunch counter and now this is kind of like a boycott or protest. Now you can't sell to customers, right? We're trying to economically restrict your business. But they're doing it to make a point about the inclusivity of the market, right? Namely that race is unfairly keeping people out of the economic market. And so I don't know if you're fine with making an allowance for that in your account. I'm a little bit worried that starts to lean back towards account number 2, or if we are doing something for the sake of equality or for the sake of an inclusive market, then that is going to be permissible to do. So what do you think about that reasoning?
Yeah, that's fascinating and great point. So I guess maybe the idea is that impersonalism itself is a conscientious commitment. And that I'm saying, and so is that absolute? Am I sort of crowning that as that's the one that counts? None of the rest do? I do think so. I guess maybe I'm not sort of immune to sort of just adopting a larger ideology, because I guess it goes down to this sort of debate as, is liberalism itself neutral or not neutral? Some people say to be a liberal is to be not neutral because you're saying explicitly that these things don't matter and these things do, which is I'm saying diverse interaction, markets matter, etc. So I guess I'm fine with being either neutral or not neutral. I guess I'm just trying to identify the value, but I think you're totally right that I need to think about how that relates number 3 to number 2 in particular. Is it just sort of an alternative substantive value? But that's really helpful. Thank you.
And we have in the chat Chelsea Green. Chelsea, do you want to unmute or do you want me to read your question?
Sure, I can unmute.
Okay.
I just it seems like there's an idealistic kind of feel to this where we really don't have perfect political systems, and the market itself has a lot of flaws and failures. Maybe you could address that.
Yeah, sure. So this is a great point, and there's a great paper by Wahid Hussein about basically saying, okay, you should exhaust democratic mechanisms first to address social problems, but those fail. And so after you've exhausted that, then you can turn to the market. Then you can turn to what he calls a kind of market vigilantism, right? Where, okay, we've exhausted the sort of proper channel, but we still have this injustice. How do we address it? In the non-ideal world, we have to use our market power. And I think, I'm definitely sensitive, and I think that's one of the main objections I try to address in my paper, and it's probably the best objection. But I think what I want to say is that, well, my account still applies in many instances when we're talking about conscientious commitments that don't really affect anything, right? So a lot of times we refuse to transact because we don't want to be complicit. It has nothing to do with battling injustice. It's just has everything to do with us not involving ourselves because we don't want to be associated with that person, right? So even if we start to make allowances, which I need to think more about for battling injustice, when there's failures of political mechanisms, there's still a whole range of conscientious commitments which aren't sort of serving that end, and that we should sort of still shun when we're refusing to sell. But thank you so much for your questions. And
I would just add, the corporations under Citizens United, they have political speech, so they're the markets are intertwined with our political system in such a way.
I agree. Thank you so much. I'll defer to Kate, I guess, but thank you for your question.